The cleaning cart squeaked as James pushed it down the marble hallway of Meridian Industries headquarters, his worn sneakers silent against the polished floor. He had no idea that in 30 minutes he would stand before a room full of billionaires and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate power. He didn't know that his late wife's final investigation would finally see justice, or that the COO would face an impossible choice between profit and truth. All James knew was that he needed this job to feed his daughter, and the conference room on the 42nd floor needed to be spotless before the biggest investor meeting in company history. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Seattle skyline as Jaime Rodriguez wheeled his cleaning supplies toward the executive conference room. At 38, his calloused hands told the story of a man who had worked every honest job available to keep his family afloat. His dark hair showed premature streaks of gray, souvenirs from sleepless nights spent juggling 2 jobs and single parenthood. The navy blue custodial uniform hung loose on his lean frame, a testament to meals skipped so his 8-year-old daughter Sophia could have seconds. 3 floors below, in the opulent boardroom preparation area, COO Daniel Hayes adjusted his silk tie and reviewed his presentation notes one final time. At 4 to 5, Daniel commanded respect in every room he entered. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, and his confident demeanor had convinced investors to pour billions into Meridian Industries over the past decade. Today's presentation would be his crowning achievement, the pitch that would secure the largest pharmaceutical investment in company history. But Daniel carried a secret that gnawed at his conscience during quiet moments. The revolutionary cancer treatment data he was about to present contained fabricated results, manipulated statistics that painted a miraculous picture of breakthrough medicine that didn't actually exist. The real trials had shown modest improvements at best, nothing close to the world-changing results his slides would claim. James pushed open the heavy oak doors of Conference Room A, the same room where his wife Maria had once presented her own research findings. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 2 years ago, Maria Rodriguez had been Meridian's lead biostatistician, a brilliant woman whose integrity had ultimately cost her everything. She had discovered irregularities in clinical trial data, evidence that someone was manipulating results to inflate success rates. Her attempts to expose the truth had led to her dismissal, and the stress of fighting the corporate machine had contributed to the heart attack that took her life 6 months later. The irony wasn't lost on James that he now cleaned the same building where his wife had fought her final battle. Desperation had driven him to take any job that offered health insurance for Sophia, even if it meant working for the company that had destroyed his family. Every night, he promised Maria's memory that someday he would find a way to honor her sacrifice, to ensure that her discovery of the truth wouldn't die with her. As James began arranging chairs around the massive conference table, he reflected on the conversation he'd had with Sophia the previous evening. She had asked why Mommy had to work so hard before she got sick, why the bad people at her work had made her so sad. James had struggled to explain corporate corruption to an 8-year-old, settling for reassurances that Mommy had always tried to help sick people get better medicine. Sophia had nodded solemnly and made him promise that he would help sick people too, someday. 40 minutes before the investor meeting was scheduled to begin, Daniel Hayes stood in his corner office, reviewing the presentation slides that would determine Meridian's future. The company's stock price had been declining for months, and several board members had quietly suggested that without a major breakthrough, significant layoffs would be inevitable. The fabricated cancer treatment data would solve everything, securing enough investment capital to fund legitimate research while keeping thousands of jobs intact. Daniel's assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Sir, the investors from Goldman Sachs and BlackRock have arrived early. They're requesting a private preview of the key findings." "Tell them 15 minutes, Daniel replied, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. "And make sure that conference room is absolutely perfect. We cannot afford any distractions today." Meanwhile, James had finished setting up the chairs and was now dusting the enormous screen where the presentation would be displayed. His mind wandered to Maria's final weeks, when she had stayed up late into the night, hunched over her computer, trying to decode the statistical manipulations she had discovered. She had printed dozens of reports, highlighting discrepancies and calculating what the real success rates should have been. Those papers were still stored in a box in their tiny apartment, evidence that James had never known what to do with. The conference room door opened, and Daniel Hayes entered with 3 immaculately dressed investors. James immediately moved toward his cleaning cart, hoping to become invisible, as he had learned to do in the presence of executives. But something made him glance at the screen as Daniel began his preview presentation. "Gentlemen, what you're about to see represents the most significant breakthrough in cancer treatment in 50 years, Daniel began, clicking to his first slide. The screen filled with data charts showing unprecedented success rates for a drug called miracelin. Our Phase 3 trials have demonstrated a 93% remission rate in pancreatic cancer patients, with minimal side effects." James froze, his dust cloth halfway to the conference table's surface. Those numbers, that presentation format, the statistical layout, it was all horrifyingly familiar. He had seen these exact charts before, in Maria's research, but she had exposed them as fabricated. The real success rate had been 37%, still promising, but nowhere near the miraculous claims being made. "The market potential is extraordinary," Daniel continued, clicking to financial projections. "Conservative estimates suggest $20 billion in revenue within the first 3 years of FDA approval." What of the investors? A woman in her 60s with sharp eyes leaned forward. "These results seem almost too good to be true, Daniel. What's your confidence level in the data integrity?" "Absolutely bulletproof," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Our lead biostatistician personally verified every calculation before. Unfortunately, she passed away last year. But her work was thorough and unimpeachable." James felt the room spinning around him. Daniel was using Maria's death to legitimize the very lies she had died trying to expose. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had experienced since losing his wife. Here was the man who had destroyed Maria's career, stolen her research, falsified her conclusions, and now he was invoking her memory to sell those lies to investors. The cleaning cart's wheel caught on the carpet as James backed away from the table, causing a loud scraping sound that drew attention from the 4 people at the front of the room. Daniel glanced over with mild irritation. "Sorry," James muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'll come back later." "No need," Daniel said dismissively. "Just try to be quieter." But James couldn't leave. As Daniel continued his presentation, showing slide after slide of manipulated data, James felt Maria's presence in the room. He could almost hear her voice, urging him to speak up, to finally give her research the voice it deserved. The promise he had made to Sophia echoed in his mind: help sick people get better medicine. The lies being presented weren't just about money. Patients with terminal cancer would receive false hope. Families would mortgage their futures for a treatment that wouldn't work as promised. The real breakthrough treatments, the ones that actually showed 37% success rates, would be overshadowed and underfunded because investors would pour money into this fabricated miracle instead. Daniel clicked to his next slide, showing testimonials from supposedly cured patients. James recognized the format immediately. It was identical to Maria's original presentation structure, but with fabricated testimonials inserted where real, modest success stories had once been. Our patient 0 was a 43-year-old mother of 2 from Portland, Daniel was saying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, given 3 months to live. After 6 months of miracelin treatment, her tumors were undetectable. James knew that patient. Maria had told him about her real story. The woman had responded well to treatment, but had experienced significant side effects and required ongoing therapy. She was alive and improving. But she wasn't the miraculous recovery Daniel was describing. The investor from BlackRock was taking notes frantically. "This changes everything we know about oncology treatment protocols. When can we expect FDA fast-track approval?" "We're submitting next month," Daniel replied confidently. "With results like these, we anticipate approval within 18 months. James gripped his dustcloth so tightly his knuckles turned white. The FDA submission would be based on the same falsified data. Real patients would receive a treatment that had been misrepresented to them. Some might die, believing they had received the best possible care. never knowing that more effective alternatives existed. The weight of Maria's sacrifice pressed down on his shoulders. She had lost her job, her health, and ultimately her life, trying to prevent exactly this scenario. Her final words to James had been a promise that someday, someone would continue her work, someone would ensure that the truth came to light. As Daniel prepared to advance to his financial projections slide, James made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever. He stepped forward from the shadow of his cleaning cart, his voice cutting through the corporate presentation like a blade through silk. "This meeting is a lie." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniel's finger froze over his laptop trackpad. The three investors turned toward James with expressions of confusion and surprise. In the sudden silence, the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafeningly loud. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" the female investor asked, her tone a mixture of bewilderment and growing interest. James felt his heart pounding against his ribs, but Maria's memory gave him courage. "I said this meeting is a lie. Those numbers, that data, all of it, it's fabricated." Daniel's face had drained of color, but he quickly attempted to regain control of the situation. "I apologize for this interruption. This is James, one of our custodial staff. He's obviously confused about—" "I'm not confused," James interrupted, stepping closer to the presentation screen. "My wife was Maria Rodriguez. She was your lead biostatistician until you fired her for exposing this exact fraud 2 years ago." The name Maria Rodriguez clearly meant something to the investors. The man from Goldman Sachs sat up straighter, while the BlackRock representative began typing rapidly on her phone. "Maria Rodriguez," the older investor repeated slowly. "Wasn't she the researcher who died of a heart attack after leaving Meridian under controversial circumstances?" Daniel's jaw tightened. Maria Rodriguez was a valued team member who unfortunately became, let's say, overzealous in her interpretation of preliminary data. Her conclusions were reviewed and found to be based on incomplete understanding of our methodology. "That's a lie," James said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She found that you were manipulating trial results, inflating success rates, hiding side effects. She tried to report it through proper channels, and you destroyed her career." The room fell silent, except for the continuing tap of fingers on phone screens. James realized that the investors were researching Maria's story in real time, cross-referencing his claims with publicly available information. Daniel attempted to salvage the situation by appealing to class distinctions. "Gentlemen, I hardly think we need to allow our business discussion to be derailed by conspiracy theories from someone who—" "Someone who what?" James challenged, stepping even closer to the screen. "Someone whose wife died trying to protect cancer patients from exactly what you're doing right now?" The female investor closed her laptop with a definitive snap. "Mr. Hayes, I think we need to hear what this gentleman has to say. If there are questions about data integrity, we need those addressed before we can consider any investment." Daniel realized his careful presentation was slipping away from him, but he couldn't afford to abandon it entirely. Too much was at stake, not just for him personally, but for the thousands of Meridian employees whose jobs depended on securing this investment. "James," Daniel said, attempting a tone of paternal concern, "I understand you're still grieving your wife's death, and it's natural to look for someone to blame. But Maria's concerns were thoroughly investigated by our internal compliance team and found to be unsubstantiated." "Show them the real data," James demanded, pointing at the screen. "Show them what the actual success rate was." "The data you're seeing is the actual data," Daniel insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. James pulled out his phone and began scrolling through photos. "I have copies of my wife's original research. Every night for months before she died, she was working on this, trying to understand how the numbers were being manipulated." The Goldman Sachs investor leaned forward. "You have documentation of the original research?" "Everything," James replied, holding up his phone. "Charts, calculations, patient files with their real outcomes. Not the fairy tales you just told us about miraculous recoveries." Daniel's mind raced through damage control scenarios. He could claim the janitor was lying. The grief had driven him to elaborate fantasies. He could suggest that Maria's research was flawed. that she had misunderstood complex statistical models. But the investors' faces told him they were already conducting their own fact-checking, and any claims he made would be verified within hours. Even if, hypothetically, there were some discrepancies in preliminary data, Daniel began carefully. The current trial results speak for themselves. The current trial results are based on the same falsified methodology, James shot back. My wife figured out how you were doing it. You were excluding patients who didn't respond well. You were counting partial responses as complete remissions. You were shortening the follow-up period to hide relapses. The specific nature of James's accusations hit Daniel like physical blows. These weren't the vague conspiracy theories of a grieving widower. They were precise technical claims that demonstrated intimate knowledge of clinical trial manipulation techniques. The BlackRock representative looked up from her phone. I'm seeing some concerning reports about irregularities in Meridian's trial data from 2 years ago. There was an investigation by the FDA, but it was closed without findings after the lead researcher, Maria Rodriguez, died before she could complete her testimony. She died because the stress of fighting this company killed her, James said, his voice breaking slightly. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, spent every waking moment trying to prove what she knew was true. The heart attack was just her body giving up after months of trying to save patients from this fraud. Daniel felt the presentation, his career, and potentially the entire company slipping away from him. But he also felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight he had carried for years was finally being lifted from his shoulders. The lies had been eating at him, the knowledge that cancer patients were receiving false hope based on manipulated data. If I may, Daniel said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, perhaps we should postpone this presentation until we can address these concerns properly. No, said the female investor firmly. I think we should address them right now. She looked at James expectantly. Rodriguez. James Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez, you said you have documentation of the original research. Can you show us what you're talking about? James hesitated for a moment, realizing that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Exposing Meridian's fraud would likely cost him his job, the health insurance that Sophia desperately needed, and any chance of finding employment in the corporate world again. But Maria's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him of the promise he had made to their daughter about helping sick people. I'll need to get my laptop from home, James said. I have digital copies of everything Maria compiled before she died. How long would that take? The Goldman Sachs investor asked. 20 minutes. I live close by. Daniel saw an opportunity to regain some control over the spiraling situation. I don't think it's appropriate to base investment decisions on documents that may have been taken inappropriately from company systems. Maria took those documents home because she was afraid they would be destroyed, James replied. She was right. After she was fired, someone went through her office and removed everything related to her fraud investigation. The older investor stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Seattle skyline. Mr. Hayes, in 30 years of pharmaceutical investing, I've learned that when someone with nothing to gain makes serious accusations about data integrity, it's worth listening. Especially when those accusations involve a researcher who died under controversial circumstances. I understand your concern, Daniel said, attempting to salvage what remained of his credibility. But we're talking about delaying a crucial investment decision based on the unsubstantiated claims of. He paused, realizing that completing that sentence would only make things worse for him. Based on the claims of a Cress. Janitor? James asked, completing Daniel's thought. Someone whose opinion doesn't matter because he cleans floors instead of manipulating data? The room fell silent again. Daniel realized that he had inadvertently revealed his own prejudices, demonstrating exactly the kind of corporate arrogance that had driven Maria Rodriguez to her death. That's not what I meant, Daniel said weakly. Yes, it is. The BlackRock representative said sharply, and frankly, Mr. Hayes, your attitude toward this gentleman is raising as many red flags as his. Accusations about your data. James felt a surge of validation that he hadn't experienced since Maria's death. For 2 years, he had felt invisible, dismissed, irrelevant. His grief had been treated as weakness, his financial struggles as personal failure, his blue-collar status as evidence that his opinions didn't matter. Now, For the first time since losing Maria, people with real power were taking him seriously. "I'll go get the documentation," James said, moving toward the door. "Wait," Daniel called after him. The desperation in his voice surprised everyone, including himself. "Just wait a minute." James turned back toward the table, where Daniel was staring at his hands, the confident executive mask finally beginning to slip away. "What if," Daniel said slowly, "what if there were some irregularities in the data?" Hypothetically, what would that mean for the company, for the thousands of people who work here?" "It would mean telling the truth," James replied simply. "Something my wife died trying to do." The female investor exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Mr. Hayes, are you saying there actually are problems with the data you just presented to us?" Daniel felt the walls of his carefully constructed corporate life closing in around him. He thought about his own family. His teenage son, who was proud to tell his friends that his father ran a major pharmaceutical company. He thought about the Meridian employees who trusted him to guide the company through difficult times. But he also thought about the cancer patients who would receive treatments based on false promises. The families who would spend their life savings on hope that had been manufactured in a corporate boardroom. "The base treatment does work," Daniel said quietly. "It's a legitimate therapy that helps patients. But the success rates in our presentation they're optimistic projections based on extrapolated data models." "Extrapolated from what?" the Goldman Sachs investor demanded. "From a smaller sample size, with less rigorous follow-up protocols than what we presented today." James felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Daniel's partial admission confirmed everything Maria had discovered, but it also meant that her death had been preventable. If the company had listened to her concerns 2 years ago, if they had corrected the problems instead of silencing the whistleblower, Maria might still be alive. "So the actual success rate is what?" the BlackRock representative asked. Daniel looked at James, then back at the investors. 37% complete remission, 61% significant improvement, with manageable side effects in most patients. "Those are still impressive numbers," the older investor said. "Why fabricate better results?" Because 37% doesn't generate $20 billion in investment," James answered before Daniel could respond. "Because modest success doesn't create stock price miracles or justify executive bonuses." Daniel nodded slowly, the fight finally leaving him entirely. "Because the board was demanding breakthrough results or massive layoffs. Because I convinced myself that a little exaggeration would be harmless if it saved jobs and funded research that might eventually achieve the results we were claiming." The room fell silent as the full scope of the situation became clear. Daniel had committed fraud. But his motivations were more complex than simple greed. The corporate pressure to deliver impossible results had created a situation where lying seemed like the most responsible choice available. "Mr. Rodriguez," the female investor said, "I'd still like to see your wife's documentation. Not because I don't believe what we've heard here, but because we need to understand the full scope of what happened." "Of course," James replied. "But can I ask what this means for Meridian? There are a lot of good people working here who had nothing to do with this." Daniel looked up at James with surprise. After everything Meridian had done to his family, the janitor was still concerned about protecting innocent employees. "That's not for us to decide right now," the Goldman Sachs investor said, "but I can tell you that falsified data means no investment from us and probably significant regulatory scrutiny." "Which means layoffs anyway," Daniel said bitterly. "I tried to prevent them by lying, and now I've guaranteed them by getting caught." James walked back toward the conference table and sat down across from Daniel, ignoring the protocol that said custodial staff didn't sit in executive meetings. "Maybe there's another way," James said thoughtfully. "What if Meridian came forward voluntarily? What if the company admitted the data problems, corrected the record, and refocused on developing the treatment that actually works?" "That's corporate suicide," Daniel replied. "The stock would crash, the FDA would launch investigations, competitors would use our honesty against us. But patients would get accurate information about their treatment options," James countered. "Doctors could make informed decisions. Families wouldn't mortgage their futures, based on false hope. The BlackRock representative was typing notes rapidly. There might be some merit to a voluntary disclosure approach. Companies that come forward before regulators catch them sometimes receive more lenient treatment. Sometimes, the older investor emphasized, but it would still mean significant financial losses, possible criminal charges for executives involved in the falsification, and years of rebuilding trust. Daniel stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city where thousands of cancer patients were hoping for medical breakthroughs. You know what the worst part is? The real treatment, the 37% success rate, it's still revolutionary. In most pancreatic cancer cases, patients are lucky to get 6 months of additional life. We're talking about complete remission for more than a third of patients, significant improvement for another 60%. If we had just told the truth from the beginning, it would have been celebrated as a genuine breakthrough. So why didn't you? James asked quietly. Because 37% wasn't good enough for the board, wasn't good enough for the investors, wasn't good enough for the media coverage we needed to attract top researchers, Daniel replied. In a world where everyone expects miracles, incremental progress feels like failure. James thought about Maria's final months, the way she had agonized over the ethical implications of allowing patients to receive false hope. She had understood that even modest medical breakthroughs could save lives, but only if they were presented honestly and developed responsibly. My wife used to say that the most important part of medical research wasn't discovering miracle cures, it was earning the trust of patients who had no other options, James said. She believed that trust was more valuable than any drug, because without it, even real treatments wouldn't work. Daniel turned away from the window, his eyes red with exhaustion and stress. Your wife was right, and I destroyed that trust by trying to manufacture miracles instead of celebrating real progress. The female investor closed her laptop decisively. Gentlemen, I think we've heard enough for now. Mr. Hayes, we'll need full documentation of the actual trial results, corrected data, and a timeline for FDA disclosure. Mr. Rodriguez, we'll review your wife's research as corroborating evidence. What about the investment? Daniel asked. There won't be one, at least not based on falsified data, the Goldman Sachs investor replied. But if Meridian handles this correctly, comes forward voluntarily, corrects the record, and refocuses on legitimate research, there might be opportunities for smaller, more realistic funding in the future. James felt a strange sense of resolution settling over him. Maria's work would finally see the light of day, patients would receive honest information about their treatment options, and Meridian might eventually emerge as a more ethical company. But he also realized that his life was about to become significantly more complicated. Mr. Hayes, James said, standing up to face the COO directly. I know this probably means I'll lose my job, and I understand that. I just hope you'll give me enough notice to find something else before my health insurance runs out. My daughter needs her medications. Daniel stared at James for a long moment, processing the fact that the man who had just destroyed his career presentation was still worried about being treated fairly by the company that had killed his wife. James, Daniel said slowly, you're not losing your job. In fact, I think Meridian needs someone like you in a more prominent position. Someone who prioritizes truth over convenience, patience over profits. I'm not qualified for executive positions, James replied. I'm a janitor with a high school education. You're a man who risked everything to protect cancer patients from receiving false hope, Daniel corrected. That's exactly the kind of qualification this company needs more of. The investors exchanged surprised glances. Daniel's offer to promote the whistleblower who had exposed his fraud was either a desperate attempt to appear reformed or a genuine recognition that Meridian needed to change its entire corporate culture. What kind of position are you talking about? The BlackRock representative asked skeptically. Patient advocacy, Daniel replied, the idea forming as he spoke. Someone whose job it is to review trial data from the patient perspective, to ask the questions that researchers and executives might overlook. Someone who reports directly to the board, outside the normal corporate hierarchy. James felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of his circumstances. An hour ago, he had been invisible, pushing a cleaning cart through marble hallways. Now, he was being offered a chance to continue Maria's work, to ensure that other families wouldn't experience the devastation that had consumed his own. "I'd need training," James said carefully. "I understand the basic concepts because Maria explained them to me, but I'm not a scientist." "We'll provide whatever education and support you need," Daniel promised. "And your salary will reflect the importance of the position to the company's future integrity." The older investor stood up and extended his hand to James. "Mr. Rodriguez, I think you've done something remarkable here today. You've potentially saved countless patients from receiving false information, and you've given Meridian a chance to redeem itself by telling the truth." As James shook hands with each of the investors, he felt Maria's presence in the room more strongly than ever. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. Her research would finally protect the patients she had died trying to help. "There's one more thing," James said, as the investors prepared to leave. "When Meridian makes its voluntary disclosure to the FDA, I want my wife's name on the report. Maria Rodriguez should be credited as the lead researcher who discovered these problems. Her work deserves to be recognized." And Daniel nodded immediately. "Of course. In fact, I think we should establish the Maria Rodriguez Research Integrity Award, an annual recognition for researchers who prioritize ethical standards over corporate pressure." The suggestion caught James by surprise, but it felt right. Maria's legacy would live on not just in the corrected data, but in an ongoing commitment to research integrity that might prevent future tragedies. As the investors gathered their materials and prepared to leave, the female representative turned back to James one final time. "Mr. Rodriguez, what you did today took enormous courage. But I have to ask, what made you finally speak up? You could have stayed silent, kept your job, avoided all this controversy." James thought about Sophia, about the promise he had made to help sick people get better medicine, about the 2 years he had spent feeling powerless to honor Maria's memory. "My daughter asked me to promise that I would help sick people the way her mother tried to do," James replied. "Today was the first chance I've had to keep that promise." Daniel felt a profound shift in his understanding of leadership as he watched James prepare to leave the conference room. For years, he had believed that protecting the company meant protecting profits, that success was measured in stock prices and investment dollars. But James had shown him that real leadership meant protecting people, even when it was costly and difficult. "James," Daniel called as the janitor reached the door. "Tomorrow morning, don't bring your cleaning cart. Come to my office, and we'll start planning how to rebuild this company the right way." As James walked back through the marble hallways of Meridian Industries, his footsteps seemed different somehow, more purposeful, more confident. He was no longer invisible, no longer powerless, no longer just the janitor whose opinion didn't matter. He was Maria's husband, Sophia's father, and now Meridian's conscience. That evening, James sat in his small apartment, looking through boxes of Maria's research with new eyes. Tomorrow, these documents would help Meridian correct years of fraudulent data, protect cancer patients from false hope, and possibly save the company from complete collapse. But tonight, they were simply love letters from a wife who had trusted him to carry on her work when she no longer could. Sophia looked up from her homework as James closed the final box of documents. "Daddy, did you help sick people today, like you promised?" James pulled his daughter close, thinking about the cancer patients who would receive honest information about their treatment options, the investors who would make decisions based on real data, and the Meridian employees who might keep their jobs because their company chose truth over convenient lies. "Yes, sweetheart," James replied, kissing the top of Sophia's head. "Today, I finally helped sick people, just like Mommy would have wanted." 3 months after the confrontation in Conference Room A, the landscape of Meridian Industries had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The voluntary disclosure to the FDA had triggered a cascade of investigations, media scrutiny, and corporate soul-searching that reached every corner of the pharmaceutical industry. Camas Rodriguez, who had once pushed a cleaning cart through marble hallways in anonymity, now occupied a corner office on the 38th floor with a brass nameplate reading Director of Research Integrity, Patient Advocacy. The transformation hadn't been smooth or without casualties. Within 2 weeks of the investor meeting, 3 senior executives had resigned under pressure from the board of directors. The stock price had plummeted by 47% before stabilizing at a level that reflected the company's actual assets rather than inflated promises. Several major clinical trials had been suspended pending complete data review, and the legal department was working overtime to address potential lawsuits from patients who had received treatments based on misleading information. But something unexpected had happened in the midst of the corporate chaos. When Meridian announced its voluntary disclosure and commitment to research integrity, applications from top scientists began flooding the human resources department. Researchers who had been disillusioned by the industry's emphasis on profit over patients saw an opportunity to work for a company that had chosen painful honesty over comfortable lies. Dr. Sarah Chen had been one of the first prominent researchers to join Meridian's restructured team. A former oncologist at Johns Hopkins who had left clinical practice after becoming frustrated with pharmaceutical companies' marketing tactics, she now served as Meridian's chief medical officer. Her first meeting with James had been awkward, as she struggled to understand how someone without formal scientific training could effectively oversee research integrity. "I've reviewed your wife's documentation," Dr. Chen had told James during their initial conversation. "Her statistical analysis was remarkable. Where did she learn to identify data manipulation techniques with such precision?" "She taught herself," James had replied. "Maria always said that if you really care about something, you'll find a way to understand it completely." She cared about cancer patients more than anything else in the world. Over the following weeks, Dr. Chen had come to appreciate James's unique perspective on research ethics. While she understood the technical aspects of clinical trials, James brought something equally valuable: an unwavering focus on how research decisions affected real families. His questions during protocol review meetings were often simple but profound. How would patients understand this information? What would this mean for a family trying to decide between treatment options? Are we giving people false hope or genuine reasons for optimism? The Maria Rodriguez Research Integrity Award had been established with significant fanfare. But its first recipient had surprised the entire scientific community. Rather than honoring a senior researcher or prominent academic, the award went to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a junior biostatistician who had questioned irregularities in a diabetes medication trial. Her concerns had been dismissed by senior colleagues until James personally reviewed her findings and escalated them to Dr. Chen. This is exactly what Maria would have done, James had explained to the board of directors when recommending Dr. Walsh for the award. She saw something wrong, she documented it carefully, and she refused to stay quiet, even when people told her she was making trouble. The diabetes medication investigation had uncovered another pattern of data manipulation, this one involving a drug that was already on the market. The discovery led to a voluntary recall that cost Meridian $87 million but prevented potentially thousands of patients from experiencing undisclosed side effects. The recall announcement had actually boosted investor confidence, as it demonstrated that the company was serious about prioritizing patient safety over short-term profits. James's new role required him to travel frequently, visiting clinical trial sites, meeting with patient advocacy groups, and speaking at medical conferences about research ethics. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now flew first class to Beatty, destinations he had once only seen in Maria's research presentations. But the most meaningful aspects of his work happened closer to home. In meetings with patients and families who were navigating treatment decisions based on Meridian's research, one particularly powerful encounter occurred during a patient advisory council meeting in Portland, Oregon. James was presenting updated data on the pancreatic cancer treatment that had been at the center of the original fraud when a woman in her 50s raised her hand during the question period. "My name is Patricia Hendricks," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was patient 0 in your original trials, the one your former COO talked about in his presentation. I need you to know what really happened." The room fell silent as Patricia continued. "I did respond well to the treatment initially. My tumors shrank significantly, and for 6 months, my family thought I was going to beat this thing completely. But then the cancer came back, and it was more aggressive than before. I've been fighting it for 3 years now, with good days and bad days." James felt his heart racing as he realized this was the same patient Daniel Hayes had misrepresented in his fraudulent presentation. According to Daniel's version, Patricia had achieved complete remission and returned to perfect health. The reality was far more complex and difficult. "I want to thank you for telling the truth about my case," Patricia continued. "When I heard about the corrected data, I was angry at first. I thought you were taking away hope from other patients. But then I realized that false hope is worse than realistic hope. My family and I have made better decisions about my care because we understood what the treatment could and couldn't do." After the meeting, James spent an hour talking privately with Patricia and her husband. They shared stories about navigating the healthcare system, dealing with insurance companies, and maintaining hope while accepting uncertainty. Patricia's grace in the face of terminal illness reminded James powerfully of Maria's final months, when she had continued fighting for research integrity even as her own health was failing. "Your wife would be proud of what you're doing," Patricia told James as they parted. "The truth is harder to live with sometimes, but it's the only foundation you can build real hope on." Back in Seattle, James's relationship with Daniel Hayes had evolved in unexpected ways. Rather than re-signing in disgrace, Daniel had accepted a significant demotion and salary reduction to remain with Meridian as Senior Vice President of Research Operations. His new role involved implementing the oversight systems that would prevent future data manipulation. Working directly under James's supervision in matters related to research integrity, their weekly meetings had initially been tense affairs, filled with awkward silences and unspoken recriminations, but gradually, a working relationship had developed based on their shared commitment to rebuilding Meridian's ethical foundation. Daniel's corporate pressure experience combined with James's patient-focused perspective created a partnership that was more effective than either man could have achieved alone. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if your wife had lived," Daniel confided during one of their meetings. "If I had listened to her concerns, instead of trying to silence them, Maria might still be alive, and Meridian might have become an industry leader in research integrity from the beginning." "Maria always said that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now," James replied. "She would want us to focus on what we can still accomplish, not what we failed to do before." The philosophical transformation at Meridian had attracted attention from regulatory agencies, patient advocacy groups, and competitors throughout the pharmaceutical industry. James found himself testifying before congressional committees, speaking at FDA advisory panels, and consulting with other companies that wanted to implement similar integrity programs. His lack of formal scientific credentials, once a source of embarrassment, had become an asset that helped him connect with patients and families in ways that traditional executives couldn't. During one particularly memorable congressional hearing, a senator had attempted to dismiss James's testimony by highlighting his background as a janitor. The senator's condescending tone had backfired spectacularly when James responded with quiet dignity and devastating effectiveness. "Senator, you're absolutely right that I used to clean floors and empty trash cans," James had said into the microphone. "But that work taught me something important about paying attention to details that other people ignore. When you're responsible for cleaning up other people's messes, you get very good at noticing when something isn't right." The exchange had gone viral on social media, with millions of people sharing videos of James's response, along with commentary about the dignity of all honest work and the importance of diverse perspectives in corporate leadership. The hashtag #JanitorWisdom had trended for 3 days, with people sharing stories about insights they had gained from blue-collar workers, service employees, and others whose voices were typically ignored in policy discussions. Sofia Rodriguez, now 9 years old, had adapted to her father's new prominence with remarkable composure. She enjoyed visiting his office, where she had her own small desk, and often helped him review patient communications for language that might be confusing to families. Her perspective as a child who had lost a parent to stress-related illness brought a unique urgency to discussions about research transparency. "Daddy, why do the medicine people use such big words?" Sophia asked one afternoon while helping James review a patient information sheet. "If sick people can't understand what the medicine does, How can they decide if they want it? Her question had led to a complete overhaul of Meridian's patient communication materials, with all technical documents being reviewed by focus groups that included children, elderly patients, and adults. Quote, with limited formal education, the Sophia test, as it came to be known internally, required that any information given to patients be comprehensible to a 9-year-old who was helping her family make medical decisions. The financial impact of Meridian's transformation had been severe, but not catastrophic. The company's market value had stabilized at roughly 60% of its pre-disclosure level, but operating margins had actually improved as resources were redirected from marketing inflated claims to developing genuinely effective treatments. Several smaller biotechnology companies had approached Meridian about partnerships, specifically because of its reputation for research integrity. The most significant validation of the company's new direction came when the pancreatic cancer treatment at the center of the SEND original fraud received FDA approval based on the honest 37% success rate that Maria Rodriguez had originally calculated. The approval process had taken longer than anticipated because regulators wanted to conduct additional verification of the corrected data, but the final result was a treatment that patients and doctors could trust completely. Dr. Michael Stevenson, the FDA official who had overseen the approval process, publicly credited Meridian's voluntary disclosure with setting a new standard for pharmaceutical industry transparency. When companies are willing to correct their own mistakes and prioritize patient safety over stock prices, it makes our job as regulators much more effective, he had said during the approval announcement. The success of the pancreatic cancer treatment had led to renewed investor interest in Meridian, but this time based on realistic projections and honest data. A consortium led by the same BlackRock representative who had witnessed James's original confrontation committed $400 million to fund expansion of the treatment program and development of GRAL-related therapies. We're investing in Meridian because they've proven they can be trusted to tell us the truth about both successes and failures, the investor explained during the funding announcement. In an industry where false promises are common, authentic integrity is incredibly valuable. James had used his growing influence to push for industry-wide reforms that would prevent other families from experiencing the tragedy that had consumed his own. He testified in favor of legislation requiring pharmaceutical companies to disclose when lead researchers raised concerns about data integrity, even if those researchers were subsequently terminated. The Maria Rodriguez Protection Act, as it was informally known, would make it illegal to fire employees for reporting suspected research fraud and would require companies to maintain independent ombudsman offices staffed by people outside the normal BIA corporate hierarchy. The legislation faced significant opposition from pharmaceutical industry lobbying groups, but James's testimony had been compelling and widely publicized. His description of Maria's final months, struggling to expose fraud while facing professional retaliation and personal stress, had moved several key senators to support the bill. My wife died believing that she had failed to protect cancer patients from false hope, James had told the Senate committee. But her work is still saving lives today because someone finally listened to what she was trying to tell us. We need laws that make sure other researchers don't have to choose between their careers and their consciences. The personal toll of James's new prominence had been significant, but manageable. Death threats from people who blamed him for Meridian's stock decline had required him to hire security consultants and modify his daily routines. Sophia's school had implemented additional safety protocols after someone had posted threatening messages on social media. But the overwhelming response from patients, families, and healthcare professionals had been supportive and grateful. Letters arrived daily from cancer patients who credited James with ensuring they received honest information about their treatment options. Medical students wrote to thank him for demonstrating that ethical leadership could come from unexpected sources. Parents of children with serious illnesses expressed gratitude that someone was fighting to make sure medical research prioritized patients over profits. One letter particularly moved James. It came from Dr. Angela Martinez, a biostatistician at a competing pharmaceutical company who had been following Maria's story since the original disclosure. Mrs. Rodriguez's research was brilliant, but what made her truly remarkable was her willingness to sacrifice everything to protect patients she would never meet, Dr. Martinez had written. Your decision to honor her work by speaking up in that boardroom has inspired researchers throughout the industry to prioritize integrity over convenience. Because of your courage, Maria's legacy will continue protecting patients for generations. The letter had arrived on the second anniversary of Maria's death, a day that James had been dreading. But instead of overwhelming grief, he felt a sense of completion and purpose that had been missing since losing his wife. Her work was not only vindicated but had become the foundation for systemic changes that would protect countless future patients. Daniel Hayes had approached James that afternoon with an unusual request. "I know this is a difficult day for you, but I was wondering if you would consider speaking at our company-wide meeting about Maria's legacy and what it means for our future direction." James had agreed, and his speech to the assembled Meridian employees had become one of the most widely quoted addresses in pharmaceutical industry history. Speaking without notes in front of more than 2,000 employees, James had delivered a message that was both deeply personal and broadly applicable. "My wife Maria didn't set out to become a hero or a symbol," James had begun. "She was just a scientist who cared more about cancer patients than about corporate politics. When she discovered that data was being manipulated, she couldn't stay quiet because she knew that real people would suffer from false information." As James continued speaking, the auditorium had fallen completely silent. Even employees, who had initially been skeptical of the company's new direction, found themselves moved by his description of Maria's final crusade for research integrity. "Some of you probably think that telling the truth cost Meridian too much money, too many jobs, too much reputation in the industry," James had continued. "But I want you to consider what lying was costing us. It was costing us the trust of patients who deserved honest information. It was costing us the respect of researchers who wanted to work for ethical companies. Most importantly, it was costing us the ability to look at ourselves in the mirror and know that our work was actually helping sick people instead of just generating profits." End quote. The speech had ended with a standing ovation that lasted more than 5 minutes. But more importantly, it had marked a turning point in employee morale and commitment to the company's new ethical standards. Surveys conducted in the months following the speech showed that job satisfaction at Meridian had increased significantly despite the financial challenges facing the company. Dr. Sarah Chen had used the momentum from James's speech to launch an ambitious research initiative focused on developing treatments for rare diseases that were typically ignored by pharmaceutical companies because they affected too few patients to generate significant profits. The Maria Rodriguez Rare Disease Research Program committed Meridian to dedicating 15% of its research budget to conditions affecting fewer than 50,000 patients worldwide. "This is exactly what Maria would have wanted," James had told the board when approving funding for the rare disease program. She believed that pharmaceutical companies had a moral obligation to help all patients, not just the ones who could make them rich. The Rare Disease Initiative had attracted partnerships with patient advocacy groups, academic medical centers, and government agencies that provided additional funding and resources. Within 18 months, the program had identified promising treatments for 3 conditions that had previously received minimal research attention. The work was financially challenging, but had generated enormous goodwill and attracted top researchers who wanted to work on meaningful projects. James's role had expanded beyond Meridian to include consulting work with other pharmaceutical companies, regulatory agencies, and patient advocacy groups. His unique perspective, as someone who had experienced the healthcare system as both an insider and a patient's family member, made him an effective bridge between different constituencies that often struggled to communicate with each other. During one particularly impactful consultation, James had worked with a small biotechnology company that was struggling to design clinical trials for a childhood cancer treatment. The researchers were brilliant scientists, but they were having difficulty creating protocols that would be acceptable to families facing desperate circumstances. "You're thinking like scientists, which is important, but you also need to think like parents," James had advised them. "When your child is dying, you don't just want to know about statistical significance and confidence intervals. You want to know what the treatment will feel like, how it will affect your child's daily life, and what you should tell your other children about what's happening." End quote. His recommendations had led to a complete redesign of the clinical trial protocols, with much more extensive support services for families and clearer communication about both potential benefits and realistic expectations. The revised trial design had been so successful that it became a model for pediatric oncology research throughout the industry. The third anniversary of Maria's death found James in a place he could never have imagined when he was pushing a cleaning cart through Meridian's hallways. He was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Research Ethics, speaking to an audience of 3,000 researchers, regulators, and patient advocates from around the world. Sophia, now 10 years old and increasingly sophisticated in her understanding of her father's work, had helped him prepare his remarks. "Daddy, you should tell them about Mommy's box of papers," Sophia had suggested. "The one you used to look at when you were sad, before you became famous." The box of papers had indeed become central to James's understanding of his mission. Maria's handwritten notes, filled with calculations, questions, and concerns about patient welfare, had been digitized and made available to researchers studying the intersection of ethics and statistical analysis. Her methodology for detecting data manipulation had been incorporated into FDA review procedures and was being taught in graduate programs worldwide. But beyond the technical contributions, Maria's personal struggle had become a symbol of the human cost of corporate dishonesty. Medical ethicists used her story to illustrate how institutional pressure could silence whistleblowers and endanger patients. Business schools assigned case studies based on the Meridian disclosure to help future executives understand the long-term value of transparent leadership. As James prepared for his keynote address, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that moment in Conference Room A when he had declared, "This meeting is a lie." The frightened janitor worried about losing health insurance had become a confident advocate whose voice carried weight in boardrooms and congressional hearings. But the core of his message remained the same. Truth-telling required courage, but the alternative was a betrayal of everyone who depended on honest institutions. The international conference keynote had been scheduled for the afternoon, but James began his day with a private visit to Maria's grave. It had become his tradition on important anniversaries to update his wife on the progress of the work she had started. Standing beside her headstone in the quiet Seattle cemetery, James spoke aloud as if Maria could hear him. "The pancreatic cancer treatment is helping hundreds of patients now, and they all know exactly what to expect because of your research," he told her. "Daniel Hayes sends his regards, by the way. He's become a pretty good partner in all this, once he stopped trying to manage the truth instead of telling it." A light rain began falling as James continued his one-sided conversation, but he didn't seek shelter. The Pacific Northwest weather reminded him of the nights when Maria had worked late in their apartment, surrounded by statistical printouts and coffee cups, trying to decode the data manipulations that would eventually cost her everything. "Sophia is doing great, by the way. She wants to be a scientist like you when she grows up, but she also wants to help families understand medical information. I think she might end up being better than both of us at bridging that gap between research and real life." By the time James arrived at the conference center, his hair was damp from the rain, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The keynote address would be broadcast live to research institutions worldwide, and he knew that thousands of current and future scientists would be listening to his message about the ethical obligations that came with the privilege of conducting medical research. The introduction was delivered by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the young biostatistician who had been the first recipient of the Maria Rodriguez Research Integrity Award. Her own courage in questioning irregularities in diabetes medication data had led to career advancement and recognition as one of the most promising researchers in her field. "The speaker I'm about to introduce changed my life, and probably saved my career by teaching me that asking uncomfortable questions is not just acceptable in science, it's essential," Dr. Walsh told the BASH audience. Ms. Rodriguez proved that expertise isn't just about degrees and credentials, it's about caring enough to pay attention when something doesn't seem right. James stepped to the podium and looked out at an audience that included some of the most distinguished medical researchers in the world. 3 years earlier, he wouldn't have been allowed to attend such a conference, let alone address it. Now he was being asked to help set ethical standards for an entire industry. "I'm honored to be here today, but I want to begin by acknowledging that I shouldn't have to be," James began, his voice carrying clearly through the large auditorium. "The person who should be delivering this address is Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a brilliant biostatistician who discovered dangerous fraud in clinical trial data and died trying to expose it. The audience fell silent as James continued. Maria shouldn't have died fighting alone to protect cancer patients from false hope. She should have been supported by colleagues, protected by supervisors, and celebrated by an industry that values truth more than profit. The fact that I'm standing here instead of her represents both a tragedy and an opportunity. For the next 45 minutes, James delivered a speech that was both tribute to his wife's memory and challenge to the scientific community. He described the personal cost of institutional dishonesty, the way corporate pressure could corrupt even well-intentioned researchers, and the moral obligation that came with the privilege of conducting potentially life-saving research. Every time you analyze data, every time you write a research protocol, every time you present findings to colleagues, you have a choice, James told the audience. You can prioritize convenience, career advancement, and corporate approval, or you can prioritize the patients who will depend on your work to make life-and-death decisions. The speech concluded with a challenge that would be quoted in medical journals and ethics textbooks for years to come. My wife used to say that the most important question a researcher can ask is not what do these numbers show, but what do these seer numbers mean for the family sitting in an oncologist's office tomorrow morning? That question should guide every decision you make, because the people depending on your integrity may never meet you, but their lives are in your hands." End quote. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, but James barely noticed. He was thinking about Maria, about Sophia, about Patricia Hendricks, and the countless other patients whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of that confrontation in conference room A. The frightened janitor had found his voice, but more importantly, he had ensured that Maria's voice would never be silenced again. After the conference, James returned to Seattle with renewed energy for the work that lay ahead. Meridian Industries was thriving under its new ethical leadership, but challenges remained throughout the pharmaceutical industry. Other companies were beginning to adopt similar integrity programs, but change was slow and often met with resistance from executives who prioritized short-term profits over long-term trust. 5 years had passed since that transformative day in Conference Room A, and the pharmaceutical industry landscape had shifted in ways that even James couldn't have anticipated. The Maria Rodriguez Protection Act had become federal law, creating whistleblower protections that extended beyond healthcare to all industries where public safety was at stake. James had testified before 3 more congressional committees, consulted with regulatory agencies in 12 countries, and authored a best-selling book titled The Janitor's Voice: When Truth Matters More Than Position. The book had surprised everyone, including James himself. Written in collaboration with a ghostwriter who helped organize his thoughts and experiences, it had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and had been translated into 27 languages. The advance in royalties had provided financial security that James had never imagined possible, but more importantly, the book had reached millions of people with the message that ethical leadership could emerge from anywhere. Meridian Industries had become a case study taught in business schools worldwide, not as an example of corporate failure, but as a model of successful transformation. The company's stock price had not only recovered, but had reached new highs as investors recognized the long-term value of transparent practices and ethical leadership. The pancreatic cancer treatment that had been at the center of the original fraud was now helping patients in 43 countries, with success rates exactly as Maria Rodriguez had originally calculated. But James's most profound satisfaction came from the ripple effects that extended far beyond Meridian's corporate headquarters. The Maria Rodriguez Research Integrity Award had inspired similar programs at universities and research institutions worldwide. Medical schools now required coursework in research ethics, using Maria's story as a central case study. The Sophia test for patient communication had been adopted by regulatory agencies in multiple countries, ensuring that medical information was accessible to families making difficult decisions. Dr. Sarah Chen had become CEO of Meridian Industries when the board finally completed its leadership transition. Her first act had been to establish an endowment fund that would support research integrity programs at academic institutions worldwide. The fund was seeded with $50 million from Meridian's profits, but it had grown to more than $200 million through donations from researchers, patients, and pharmaceutical companies that had been inspired by Maria's story. Your wife changed how we think about the relationship between scientific research and moral responsibility, Dr. Chen told James during the fund's dedication ceremony. She proved that statistical analysis isn't just about mathematics, it's about human lives and the trust that patients place in our institutions. James had accepted a position as senior advisor for research ethics at the National Institutes of Health, working with federal agencies to develop policies that would prevent the kind of fraud that had cost Maria her life. His office in Bethesda, Maryland, was decorated with photographs of Sophia, Maria, and the patients who had benefited from Meridian's corrected research. The most prominent photograph showed Patricia Hendricks at her daughter's college graduation, still fighting cancer, but surrounded by family who understood exactly what her treatment could and couldn't achieve. Patricia had become one of James's closest collaborators, serving on advisory panels and speaking at conferences about the importance of honest medical communication. Her grace and wisdom in discussing her own terminal illness had moved audiences around the world and demonstrated why accurate information was more valuable than false hope. When doctors tell me the truth about my prognosis, it doesn't make me sadder, Patricia often told audiences. It makes me stronger, because I can make real decisions about how I want to spend whatever time I have left. Sofia Rodriguez, now 13 years old, had developed into a thoughtful teenager who understood the significance of her mother's work and her father's mission. She often accompanied James to conferences and meetings, offering insights that reminded adults why they were fighting for research integrity in the first place. During one particularly memorable FDA advisory panel meeting, Sophia had asked a question that silenced a room full of distinguished scientists and regulators. If you were explaining this treatment to your own daughter, would you use the same words you're planning to put in the patient information sheet? The question had led to a complete revision of the proposed patient communication materials, and the Sophia question had become a standard part of regulatory review processes. Medical writers now routinely ask themselves whether they would be comfortable explaining their technical language to their own children or grandchildren. Daniel Hayes had successfully completed his transformation from disgraced executive to respected advocate for corporate transparency. His book, The Cost of Convenient Lies, a former executive's journey to ethical leadership, had become required reading in MBA programs and had established him as a sought-after speaker on corporate responsibility. His partnership with James had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing other families from experiencing the Rodriguez tragedy. I spent years convincing myself that small compromises were necessary to protect the greater good, Daniel often told audiences. James taught me that there is no greater good that can be built on a foundation of lies, because eventually the truth always emerges, and when it does, the damage is far worse than it would have been if we had been honest from the beginning. The international impact of the Meridian transformation had been profound. The European Medicines Agency had adopted new requirements for data transparency that were directly inspired by Maria's research methodology. The World Health Organization had established guidelines for pharmaceutical company communications that incorporated the Sophia test. Research integrity officers, positions that barely existed before Maria's story became widely known, were now standard at major pharmaceutical companies worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Maria's legacy came from an unexpected source. Dr. Robert Chen, Sarah's younger brother and a prominent oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering, had been treating cancer patients for 15 years when he first encountered the Meridian story. His initial reaction had been skepticism, concern that too much emphasis on research integrity might slow down the development of life-saving treatments. However, his perspective changed dramatically when he began using Meridian's pancreatic cancer treatment with his own patients. The honest success rates that James and Daniel had fought to preserve allowed him to have more meaningful conversations with patients and families about treatment options, prognosis, and quality of life considerations. For the first time in my career, I could tell patients exactly what to expect from a treatment because the research data hadn't been manipulated to create unrealistic expectations, Dr. Robert Chan explained during a medical conference presentation. That honesty didn't discourage patients, it empowered them to make better decisions about their care. His presentation had included interviews with several of his patients who had received the pancreatic cancer treatment. Their stories demonstrated that accurate information about modest success rates was far more valuable than false promises about miraculous cures. Patients who understood the realistic outcomes were more likely to comply with treatment protocols, manage side effects effectively, and maintain hope while accepting uncertainty. James often reflected on the irony that his wife's insistence on honest statistical analysis had ultimately led to better patient outcomes than the inflated success rates that Daniel Hayes had originally wanted to promote. The 37% complete remission rate, presented honestly and supported by comprehensive patient education, had proven more effective than the 93% fairy tale that had never existed outside of manipulated spreadsheets. The 7th anniversary of Maria's death found James in a conference room very different from the one where he had made his fateful declaration. He was now chairing a meeting of the International Coalition for Research Integrity, an organization that had grown from 15 founding members to more than 300 institutional participants worldwide. The coalition's annual conference attracted thousands of researchers, regulators, patients, and advocates who shared a commitment to ethical science and transparent communication. The meeting's agenda included presentations from researchers who had used Maria's methodology to identify data manipulation in their own fields, policymakers who had implemented Sophia test requirements in their jurisdictions, and patients who had benefited from more honest medical communication. But the most moving presentation came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had been selected to receive the Coalition's Lifetime Achievement Award for her contributions to research integrity. 7 years ago, I was a junior researcher afraid to question irregularities I had discovered in a diabetes medication trial, Dr. Walsh told the audience. I thought that challenging senior colleagues would end my career before it really began. But James Rodriguez taught me that staying silent when you discover fraud doesn't protect your career, it destroys your soul. Her presentation included data showing that early detection of research irregularities, the kind of whistleblowing that Maria Rodriguez had attempted, and that Dr. Walsh had successfully accomplished, saved pharmaceutical companies an average of $150 million per incident by preventing larger scandals and regulatory penalties. The business case for research integrity had become as compelling as the ethical arguments. But the most powerful validation of Maria's legacy came from Sofia Rodriguez herself, now 17 years old and preparing to begin her freshman year at MIT. She had been accepted into a bioengineering program with a focus on medical device development, but her real passion was for the intersection of scientific research and public communication. Her high school senior project had involved developing an app that translated complex medical information into language that families could understand and use to make treatment decisions. My mom died because people in powerful positions chose convenience over truth, Sophia told the coalition meeting. But her death wasn't meaningless because it started a conversation about research integrity that has protected thousands of patients who will never know her name. That's the kind of legacy I want to build. Work that helps people even when they don't know who did it. The coalition meeting concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, the Maria Rodriguez Global Research Integrity Foundation, funded with contributions from pharmaceutical companies, regulatory DAS, agencies, and patient advocacy groups worldwide. The foundation would provide grants to researchers studying ethical issues in medical science, support whistleblower protection programs, and develop educational resources for patients and families navigating complex treatment decisions. James had been selected as the foundation's first executive director, a position that would allow him to continue Maria's work on an international scale. The appointment came with a generous salary and comprehensive benefits, but more importantly, it provided a platform for systemic change that could prevent other families from experiencing the tragedy that had shaped his own life. As James prepared to accept the position and move with Sophia to Geneva, where the foundation would be headquartered, He reflected on the journey that had brought him from a cleaning cart in a Seattle office building to leadership of a global organization dedicated to research integrity. The transformation had been painful, costly, and sometimes dangerous, but it had ultimately honored Maria's sacrifice by ensuring that her work would continue protecting patients for generations to come. The night before his departure from Seattle, James made one final visit to Maria's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the early evening light, and he felt a sense of completion that had been building slowly over the 7 years since her death. Her headstone now included an inscription that hadn't been there when she was first buried: "Dedicated researcher, devoted mother, defender of truth." "We did it, Maria," James said quietly, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. "Your research is protecting patients all over the world now. Sophia is going to study science, just like you wanted. And Daniel Hayes sends his love, believe it or not. He's become a good man once he learned to tell the truth." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree that shaded Maria's grave, and James felt a sense of her presence that had become familiar over the years. He no longer needed to imagine what she would think about the changes that had followed her death. Her legacy spoke for itself in the lives that had been saved by honest research, the careers that had been protected by whistleblower laws, and the families that had made better medical decisions because they received accurate information about their options. As James walked back through the cemetery toward his car, he thought about the janitor who had declared, "This meeting is a lie," 7 years earlier. That frightened man had been worried about losing his job, protecting his daughter's health insurance, and finding some way to honor his wife's memory. He couldn't have imagined that his moment of courage would reshape an entire industry, inspire international legislation, or create a foundation that would continue Maria's work long after he was gone. But perhaps the most important transformation had been personal. James Rodriguez had learned that heroism didn't require advanced degrees, executive titles, or corporate authority. It required only the courage to speak truth when silence would be easier, to protect others when self-protection would be safer, and to honor promises even when the cost seemed overwhelming. The janitor's voice had become the voice that everyone needed to hear, proving that in a world where power often corrupts and institutions sometimes fail, ordinary people with extraordinary integrity could still change Capri. Everything. Maria Rodriguez had died trying to protect cancer patients from false hope, but her husband had ensured that her voice would never be silenced again, echoing through research laboratories, regulatory agencies, and hospital rooms around the world, reminding everyone who would listen that the truth was always worth fighting for, no matter what the cost.